Hello, everybody. This is Steven D Kelley, and this is the Steven D Kelley Show. And we are on the one and only Truthcat Radio, www.truthcatradio.com. It's amazing just how much they don't want you to hear this program. And I'll tell you, I know someday, assuming that I can keep my digital format going, people will look back and go, wow, this is great content. But I know a lot of you find it hard to understand why I talk about the things I talk about, but trust me, everything's for a reason. But tonight, we're going to celebrate something special. And what is that thing? The thing is, it's today, May 11th, 2023, is the 211th anniversary of the assassination of Prime Minister of Britain, Spencer Perceval. So when was that? 1812. 1812. You probably heard that date before referring to other things, but that's when he was assassinated. Right Honorable Spencer Perceval. So tonight, hopefully, later on, I'll get to go out and raise a glass of stout, a pint of stout to Spencer Perceval. Now, why would I care about this guy? He's a Brit. He was kind of anti-Catholic, and little things like that. But he did a lot of good stuff. What did he do? Well, all right, I'm going to talk about one of the big things he did was he was very influential with ending slavery in the UK, ending not just slavery in the UK, but the whole practice of it and everything else. Let's talk about this guy. In a way, to me, I kind of see a similarity with him and Kennedy, and I know a lot of people say, well, that's kind of crazy. That doesn't make any sense. But when you look at the big picture, he was one of the earliest examples of people who was assassinated in office, and we're going to see a big string of this happening for one reason, and that was he got in the way of the money. He got in the way of the flow of the international money. That happens in different ways. The United States, of course, got in the flow of the international money when they said, no, we don't want your fiat currency. We're going to create our own colonial currency based on our own value. And of course, this defeated the Bank of England. And that's why we had our Revolutionary War. But we also had that War of 1812. And of course, Mr. Perceval here, Spencer, was involved with that. So before we get into all those details, we'll just start out with a little bit of history of him. Now, he was an earl, which means he was a lord, if you will. And you'll see that back in these days, even up into the 1800s, 1830s and beyond, that the system was barely a democracy. Tiny percentage of the people, of part of the population, was actually able to vote. Tiny percentage. And in the government, they had the two systems, of course, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And to be in the House of Lords, you had to be of a bloodline that had been granted this title by the Queen or the King at whatever given time, at some time in history. And this made you qualified to serve in the House of Lords. So obviously, from our standpoint here in the USA, this is a bad thing. And then when you factor in the fact that the other side, which was the House of Commons, where people would, boroughs, if you would produce MPs, ministers. These guys, half the time they're bought, half the time they're corrupt. Up until the reform in the 30s, they were very corrupt, but we're not going to get into that right now. But I'm just back to Spencer here. So the point is that Spencer was one of these guys. He was one of the elite. When I look for the good things in the guy, like I said, the first thing I can say is that he wanted to abolish the slavery. He wanted to abolish the Atlantic slave trade. But he was opposed to Catholic emancipation and reform of Parliament, which is very important. He actually argued, one of the things that he argued for was that they had this thing called rotten boroughs or pocket boroughs, and these could be areas where they had designated some town that might have gone back to way back when, that had either people living there or some sort of industrial thing going on, and it was designated a borough by the queen or whoever at that given time, and the population could have shifted, people could have left, it could have been completely industrial, there could be nobody living there whatsoever, and sometimes there will actually be territories or boroughs where there will be somebody paid just to live there so that they can still produce a sham vote for some patron's selection for MP. 2 people going to Parliament, coming from some parcel of land that's got one person living on. So obviously this was something that needed to be reformed, and apparently Spencer, and it turns out his predecessor, who we need to talk about, were against that. He was also opposed to hunting, gambling, and adultery. Okay, so he was basically a good man, if you consider that the hallmarks of a good man. And he did not drink as much as most MPs at the time, and he gave generously to charity, and he enjoyed spending time at home with his 13 children, from one woman, of course. So he had a big, huge family. Now, it was expensive to raise that many kids back then, and well, this is why he went and became an attorney, and he entered into we did this. But one other thing we should mention during the time of this, King George III was in charge, and he was considered crazy. Now, there's also something that's really important to point out, is that this was the guy that was prime minister during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, the whole business with Napoleon and all that, I don't want to get into the intrigue and conspiracy involving the Napoleonic Wars, but suffice it to say that it was during the Napoleonic Wars that the Rothschilds, through their banking endeavors, their loaning of money to the aggressors on both sides of the war, as well as their knowing who was winning and who was losing so that they could short sell the winner. Well, they short sold basically Britain. They basically convinced everybody that the French had won, and everybody started selling their assets for nothing. They started buying them all up, and then when the news came out that that the English had indeed won, those assets were worth a lot more money. And that's how the Rothschilds built their fortune. But this was all going on during the lifetime of these guys right there during the period that we remember here in the USA by the War of 1812. So this caused a depression, a big depression, for a couple of reasons. A, taxes were raised. Now, we'll get into that more with the guy that came after Spencer here. But the thing is when we say taxes were raised, we're talking about the people suddenly had to come up with the money to pay for the loans that the leaders used to pay for the wars that they got from the Rothschilds, who were doing the same thing on both sides. The French and the British were both having to pay Rothschild's Bank in France and Rothschild's Bank in London. Paris and London, obviously. So it didn't matter who won. They were going to pull this trick on that either country. But the point is that it was the people that got screwed. Now, before I go on any further, I just want to point out something real quick that's kind of important that people need to focus on, and that is what made Britain rich other than the exploitation of the colonies, and that was the textile mills, the machines that took the raw cotton and turned it into thread that they used to make the fabric, that they used to make the clothing. which is where all the money came from. Now, basically what that means is that a bale of cotton that was picked by hand by slaves in wherever, the South of the USA, by the time it reached Britain, by the time it turned into the final product, it was worth thousands of times more than the bale of hay, because that cotton had been converted into processed thread, processed fabric, processed clothing. So basically, that's called value added. This is what drove the empire, and it shouldn't be forgotten. Now, they had this economic depression, and the reason why we talk about these things, of course, is that you're not going to get the truth from Wikipedia or anybody. You've really got to read between the lines. And one of the things that they look at here is this economic depression, which we know was because of having to tax everybody and spend money to fight a war and all of this nonsense. They blamed on the Luddite riots. And the Luddites, of course, were basically people that followed a leader, whoever, but he was against this industrialization. And his thing was the evil of the textile mills. So the reality, of course, was it was the bankers. So so in this situation, you've got don't look at the bankers, don't look at the real problem, don't look at the Rothschilds who short-sold your country and forced your taxes up and forced the cost of goods to go up, et cetera, put your whole country in a depression. Well, let's blame these dummies that are breaking down machines, that are being portrayed as being idiots that are anti-technology. So there you go. That's a perfect example of distraction or diversion or pointing the finger in another direction. Now, you'll see with this assassination, they do the same thing. What basically happened to Perceval was, like I said, England was at war with France. Both sides were financed by the Rothschilds. And then eventually, the USA voted to decommission the Bank of whatever it is, America, not the Bank of America, the U.S. Bank, but it was a Rothschild bank that had been there since Alexander Hamilton. They finally got rid of it. Anyway, Rothschilds put tremendous pressure on Perceval to declare war on the U.S. Perceval didn't want to do it. And it's not because, mainly because he was tied up financially at war with France, and he didn't want to do it. He didn't want more debt. Well, so on May 11th, 1812, he went to the House of Commons for a debate and a vote, and he was assassinated in the lobby by a guy named John Bellingham. And they say that he had possible ties to the Rothschild. We'll talk about John Bellingham, but within a year, the War of 1812 was started. Completely unnecessary. Now, again, this is going to be a repeating thing, but when I talk about the lies, for instance, they lie about why this guy was assassinated. They don't mention the banks. They don't mention the fact that the banks were responsible for the depression, the anger. Well, this Bellingham guy, who was supposedly just a failed businessman, he had a suspicious nose, I'll just say that, but he was in jail. He went and did some sort of business dealings in Russia. And they threw his butt in jail in Russia for something. He flaked out. He didn't have the money. He went broke. So something he was doing in there went broke. He didn't have the money. He didn't pay his debts. They threw his ass in jail for 5 years. Now, apparently during this 5-year period, he had reached out to the government of the UK, such as it is, and in hopes that they would come to his assistance, perhaps help him get free. Now, apparently that didn't happen. But what did happen, he got very upset about that. So when he got out, he wanted revenge, but he didn't really know who he wanted. He knew that he wanted to get the Tsar, But it would be incredibly impossible for him to do that. So he said, well, I'll go after the prime minister instead. So he took whatever was left of his funds and he went and started becoming a fixture at Parliament, hanging out in the lobby and acting like he was some interested party, whatever. He was involved somehow. And of course, on that day, he brought 2 guns with him to Parliament, sewn into his jacket. 2 guns, meaning each one only fired once. And he caught Perceval. I just want to say that there's lots of details about stuff, but we'll just say that it only took 1 shot. Now, Perceval wasn't a big guy. He was relatively slight. He wore old-style clothing. He was the last prime minister to wear a powdered wig, apparently. And a lot of people kind of made fun of him, but all in all, he was a good man, and he loves his children, obviously. But the thing is that he was turning the country around. He was turning that recession around. He was bringing the country back from the problems that they came with the Napoleonic Wars. So say what you will, but his policies were starting to work right when they killed him, which is interesting to think about in itself. Because when you try to think of where all of this stuff started with the Rothschilds, where this evil started, it's hard to say. You could go back to the Bank of England. Bank of England started in 1694. What can we say about the Bank of England real quick? Well, let's see. It was created to lend King William unlimited sums at 8% annual so that he could go to war with Louis XIV of France. France at the time was not on the usury system. In other words, making money out of nothing. So this is kind of where it started, because I guess this is where everybody thought that was a good idea right up to today. I should mention really quick when we talk about banking, people wonder why the Rothschilds were so big in banking. What exactly happened? What did they do? Yes, the Templars certainly started this stuff and brought it back, but what the Rothschilds, of course, they were jewelers, and they were big jewelers, and they were jewelers that worked for the king over there where they were located. I believe it was in Frankfurt. And the thing is that people used gold as a coin. Gold was the coin. Gold, the value of the gold didn't go up and down. It was very stable. But the problem was you had to carry gold coins around. People could steal it. It made a big bulge in your pocket, whatever. The purses were heavy. Anyway, yeah, you need a horse and a buggy to carry a lot of it. But the thing is it was a stable currency. So, and the other thing, it was insecure. So what they would do, they would put it they'd take it to the jewelry shop, and they'd say, hey, Benjamin, or whatever his name was, Mail, I don't know, Amshel, put this gold in your safe over there, because it was the strongest safe in town. He said, yeah, sure. Here's a receipt. And of course, they would pay money to have that gold stored. And essentially, this is what became the interest. But sometimes people would be carrying around that receipt, and they'd be gambling, or they'd try to do some business, and they'd say, hey, look at this here receipt. It says that I've got 10 pounds of gold with Herr Rothschild over there, the jewelry store. I'll give you this receipt. I'll sign it over to you. He says, okay. So in other words, that piece of paper was good as gold. And when that guy went to reclaim it, of course, there were fees because of the storage, naturally. So there's your interest. But it didn't take very long before the jewelers figured out, hey, only 10% of all the people that are storing their gold in my safe ever come back to get it at any given time. At any given time, only 10% of everybody that puts their money in that safe ever want it back. So they realized the rest of that 90% could be rented out, whatever you want to call it, loaned at very high interest rates. So that's where all the banks came from. That's where the money came from, and that's what made the Rothschilds rich, and they did not want to see that stop. And, of course, fiat currency was international, and this is why we had war with the UK and these colonies, because they want fiat currency. And anytime you see a country that rejects the fiat currency, kind of like Germany did in the 38, bad things happen. Anyway, so let's go back to, I guess I want to go back to talk about the guy that took over for our friend Spencer here. But I should just say a couple more things about Spencer, and that is, there was a famous line that he mentioned, he said when he died. It was the name of the song that I played earlier. I know if you guys were listening to the music before my startup music, those half a dozen of you or dozen of you that were listening, that's what that was. It was called Spencer Perceval. But when he died and he was shot, that ball, whatever it was, went into him. He said, "Oh, I am murdered." And then he fell back into this very ornate chair and eventually died. The chair recently was actually put up for auction. It was, I don't know why they didn't just keep that chair, but anyway. Now, the guy that replaced him, everybody says that within a year we were at war, the USA. I got to talk about the War of 1812. But the guy that replaced him was a guy named, what was he named? Jenkinson, Robert Jenkinson, the second Earl of Liverpool. So we basically refer to him as Lord Liverpool, the Earl of Liverpool. Now, this guy also was sort of like Spencer, but different. I mean, supposedly he had different ideas about Catholic emancipation. I suspect that he perhaps was a little more Catholic, which is interesting. And certainly he had a rise up through the ranks just like Spencer did. But he also was a senior official at the East India Company, I believe it was. What was it? His first wife, Anna Jenkinson, was baptized. Let's see. His mother was the daughter of a senior East India Company official, William Watts. All right, that's it. All right, let's see. What else is what's important? When I look at this guy, though, what he did important, obviously, well, first of all, he wasn't the immediate choice to replace Spencer Perceval. He was, in fact, the fifth choice to be taken for this role. But he did basically see the end of everything. He was there for the end of slavery, the end of abolition. And let's see what else. He was very critical about the country's policy on the Russians, which is interesting. Now, what else can I tell you about this? But one of the things that he did do that was which was kind of important, and I don't really have a link up here. I thought I did for it, but there was a lot of trouble because the country was going through these turmoil because of the banking crisis and the fact that the Rothschilds had basically ripped off everybody's money, and suddenly the common citizen was being taxed up the rear end to pay for these ridiculous wars. And in one location, I believe it was, was it Manchester? Probably, huh? Liverpool? No, yeah. I think it was Manchester anyway. There was an event that took place called the Peterloo Massacre. This was in 1819, after the War of 1812. But anyway, there was 60,000 people that were, protesting, supposedly a peaceful protest. And this guy ordered the hussars, which are, troops on horses, with sabers, swords, to go in there and trample a bunch of people and stop protesting. So out of those 60,000 people, I think it was 600 people were injured, and a dozen people or so, a little over a dozen people died. They call that the Peterloo Massacre. But this was just the start of government repression. They immediately started all these acts which limited free speech. They limited the right to gather, peaceful demonstrations. And because of this, a lot of these guys were targeted for assassination. But of course, our friend was the only one that was actually assassinated. This was before any of it. But what else happened here with this guy's short stint? Again, I don't really have all the good stuff in front of me, but there's a lot of parallels that we can draw when we look at Perceval. We can draw from Perceval's assassination. And one is, here we are 211 years ago since this happened. And yet if you look into the records and you try to see what happened with Spencer here, they'll mention that some crazy man with a grudge that was a lone gunman who had no connections to anybody took out his grievances by shooting the prime minister, who happened to be against going to war for the Rothschilds, subsequently allowing someone else to come along and send the country into war for the Rothschilds. Now, again, there's no records. There's very little records, especially if you go on the internet and you try to look everything up to find out what happened about this guy Bellingham. But there's a few things that are interesting. Of course, some people say he was crazy, but they know that it took some time for him because he didn't initially set out to kill. He initially set out to try to solicit the House, the whatever, the Parliament, to have some sort of compensation for what happened to him. And as this was failing and he was running out of money, he decided to turn it around and turn this into an assassination mission, but he ran out of money. By January, he was completely out of money. But something happened. In February, suddenly, he was flush again. He had some bucks. He continued to, was paid to basically outfit himself, eat, have a hotel room nearby, and stock Parliament. And it paid off, of course, in May. So who was giving him this money? Well, we do know that there were at least two individuals that he was dealing with, one of whom which was a banker who had interest in Russia, along with another businessman who I believe also had interest in Russia. So remember, he spent time in Russia, and we know who these people are. We know who these people are, who they were doing it all. It's not just the Rothschilds, it's their agents, it's the elders, it's the ones that are calling the shots, the Jacob Frank types. Anyway, kind of reminds you of Ukraine a little bit. And it's interesting because Ukraine kind of comes into all this, believe it or not. But anyway, so here this is, Manchurian Candidate shoots this guy. Now, what's really sad is that one of the things I find kind of sad is that even with 13 children, his bloodline died out. His name died out. None of his children, none of his heirs, for whatever reason, are alive today. Even with all those children. Strange how that happened. And yet, Bellingham, his heirs are alive. One of them is actually an MP representing a parcel of land. I suppose it's one of those boroughs we were talking about earlier. But, you know, there was a plaque that they just decided to finally erect in the spot where Spencer was shot. They didn't have much of a plaque. They basically pulled up 4 tiles and stuck something else down that represented some vague thing, and that wasn't really enough. But one of the things they did have is this MP was actually there. This ancestor of Bellingham was actually there. And there's like, oh, no hard feelings, no hard feelings. And I'll tell you, a lot of people celebrated this. A lot of people in a lot of districts actually went in the streets and were happy when this all happened. But kind of like the Americans that celebrated, what was his name? Hamilton, you know. Anyway, so I find it I'm a little bitter to think that one of Bellingham's ancestors could go on to become a member of government, the same government that this guy was the head of at one time, Spencer Perceval. So yeah, that's wrong. And where are his children today? And yet people talk crap about him. This song that I played before the show, it was an ode to Bellingham. People make fun of Spencer Perceval. They called him Little P. He was a slight man. He didn't go out drinking with the boys. Whatever. That's a smear campaign. There are a couple of things I wanted to say real quick. I'm just going to say two things. I'm going to go on with this. I'm going to take a quick break, but what I want to say first before I do that, a couple things. First of all, you have to stick around because the stuff I'm going to talk about next is going to also be very interesting, and it's going to be sort of thing that I'm pretty sure none of you have heard before. A lot of you are not pieces together. But today's the 11th, of course, and on the 28th is my birthday, and I'm hoping you guys are just waiting for the big day to help me out. I know that everything's expensive and it's really terrible right now, but it's kind of scary, and I was kind of, well, I want to, never mind. But yeah, I'm hoping you guys will help out, and of course, it's Steven Kelley 714 at yahoo.com is the PayPal, and you've got to find the button that says friend or family, or I will have to return it. And it's just, for whatever reason, things are a little bit low, and we would really appreciate if you guys would say whatever. Send me a card. Okay, so what else? All right, let's go take a quick break. But before I do that, I just want to say when I come back, I need to talk about Ukraine. I need to talk about World War II. I need to talk about the strange polarity with who started wars and who didn't start wars, and how sometimes we end up demonizing somebody that really doesn't deserve to be demonized quite so much. So let me just talk about that when we get back, okay? Thank you. All right, thank you very much. I mentioned earlier that Perceval, nobody talks about Perceval, even in UK. In the UK, you would think that they would talk about it. He's the only guy, prime minister, who's ever been assassinated. But at the same time, I also said he's kind of like Kennedy. In the UK, they'll talk about Kennedy, they'll talk about Lincoln, but they won't talk about Perceval. So this is why the guy's important, because he shows a pattern that's going to go on and on and on and on and on and on. Now, like I said, Kennedy and Lincoln, yes, both of those guys are part of it. Lincoln was obviously assassinated because of the greenbacks. He created a non-fiat currency called the greenbacks, which were basically a USA silver-based economy. Same thing that Kennedy did. He did that in defiance of Lionel the Rothschilds. And, shortly thereafter, along comes John Wilkes Booth. Same thing happened to Garfield, President James Garfield. They talk crap about him. They call him names. Let's see. He was assassinated September 19th, 1881. This was during the, 1870. There were bank runs during 19th century, 1873, 1884, on and on and on, up to 1903. But anyway, he basically, he tried to shut it down. He tried to shut down this banking crap. What did he say? He said, there's a quote here, whoever controls the volume of money in any country is the absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is easily controlled one way or another by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate. Okay, now anyway, 2 weeks after he made the statement, he was shot by a guy who was apparently ticked off for not getting a diplomatic posting. Really, the lone gunman, some crazy line. Okay, anyway. Obviously, Rothschild was involved, but, they kill these guys right away. Like the guy that killed Perceval, he was hung within a week. Okay? It's all covered up. It's just like when Lincoln was killed, Edwin M. Stanton, famous guy, he covered up. He was the Secretary of War. He covered it all up. Kind of like they did with Kennedy. Let's see, who comes next? Let's see. Well, it's like right after they killed Garfield, along comes the Federal Reserve. I don't need to tell you what that's about. But then what else happens? The Russian Revolution, 1917, where they They did the Tsar, the Bolsheviks. Now we're coming into a whole new era of enemy, but we know who the enemy is. The same people that killed the Tsar, the same people that wrote the protocols. These are the guys, the Rothschilds. We know how they operate. We know who their enemies are, and we know that every single one of these people that go up against them dies. Here's another one, 1935. Some of you people probably heard about this guy, but the stuff you heard was probably very negative, like he was some sort of a corrupt politician. And that is Huey Long. He died September 10th. Seems to be a reoccurring date, huh? Or somewhere around there. 1935. Now, he was one of the only 2 U.S. senators to ever be assassinated while in office. Robert Kennedy, of course, being the other. Now, he was a Democrat, he was a populist, and he denounced the wealthy and the banks, and he called for a share of our wealth. That was his idea for a program. That was what he wanted, and it was based on, he had a history of denouncing central banks. The big thing is that he was a very much anti-Standard Oil. I could read you the whole more in-depth thing, but who's Standard Oil? Rockefeller. So who killed him? Well, you could read, obviously he was shot, but the point is that he was shot a month after announcing that he was going to run for president. So he became a serious problem because he was going to go after Standard Oil and he was going to change the system. Let's see, what else happened? Let's see, World War II started. Now, here's the thing that I should mention here. And again, if anybody knows me, I'm very much anti-Nazi. But at the same time, I'm always able to learn the truth about these things. And here, one of the things I found out, which is interesting because I know I have some German/Polish blood in me. But it turns out that before this thing started, before Hitler invaded Poland and all that, there was like 1.5 million Germans living in Poland. And what was going on was that certain elements in that country, I wonder who they were, decided it was time to kill anybody that had anything to do with Germany and spoke German, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of like what they're doing in Ukraine. When the Ukrainians said, let's go into the east here and kill anybody that speaks Russian and ban their language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and turn them into second-class citizens. Kind of like what they did to the Catholics in Britain before the emancipation. But again, these are all patterns. So they did that over there in Poland. And here's the thing. It's almost impossible to find this in the books, the history books. But guess what? There are actually documents out there, autopsy documents, very detailed autopsy documents of bodies that have been dug up of these Germans. And there were like 35,000 Germans living in Poland that were killed, men, women, children, etc., slaughtered, whatever, all sorts of little massacres, whatever. It was a genocide, obviously. It's kind of like some sort of thing you hear about going on in Rwanda or wherever, something of this nature. But anyway, it happened. Now, I'm not saying it happened all at once, kind of like the Ukrainians didn't kill all those people in Donbass all at once, which is another disputed number. But basically, 35,000 Germans were supposedly killed over there before Germans invaded. Now, one of the other things I find interesting, obviously everyone knows that this was something that was planned, but a couple things that are kind of something you should contemplate. And one is that before the Germans even started their invasion, before they even got too pissed off about all this going on, the Poles had blown up the bridges going into Germany. Now, this was to keep the victims that they're trying to kill, the Germans that were trying to get away and go back to Germany, from leaving so that they could kill them. Doesn't that sound kind of Nazi? Doesn't that sound familiar? And you could say, oh, well, they did that to keep the Nazis from coming over. Well, then why did they do that in advance? And the other thing that's kind of funny about this whole thing is that when the Germans invaded, the Soviets invaded at the same time. They took one half, the Germans took the other half, and yet Britain, they declared war on Germany because supposedly Germany invaded Poland, but they didn't declare war on the Soviets, who also invaded Poland. So that's just kind of like, wait a minute, what the heck? How can you ally with one invader but call the other invader evil, especially when you consider that 35,000 Germans were killed? Now here's another interesting fact, because it's hard to wow, the Germans were the bad guys. Sure, okay, whatever. What about the Soviets? Were they the bad guys? Well, I'll tell you something else. How about Finland? There was a period where Finland, of course, had a lot of area. It took up most of Lithuania, or what areas that we call like the Baltics and all that, all the way down to the edge of Poland again. But they lost territory to Russia. But during World War II, or right up to the point of World War II, they tried to take a bunch of that territory back. But when they took that territory back, this is the Russo-Finnish War, whatever you want to call it. I think that's what it is. This is prior to World War II, a whole other thing. They took back a lot more than the territory that was historically Finnish that was taken by Russia a long time before. And obviously the people that were living there were Russian. There weren't Finnish people. I mean, there might have been some Finnish people, but the areas that were whatever historically Finnish, they took back and then some. Now, when they did this, they started an ethnic cleansing campaign. There's that ethnic cleansing campaign thing again, just like they're doing over there in Donbass, and they outlawed the language. They made the people second-class citizens. There's that second-class citizen thing. And you know what else they did? They started killing them, etc. Now, I'll tell you, the Finns, God bless those Finns. We love them. I have friends over there, at least one. And they just joined NATO. Now, I can understand why the Soviets, or the Russians now, are a little bit concerned about Finland joining NATO, because they got this bad history. And part of that bad history is concentration camps. We think about the Germans when we think about concentration camps. I don't ever know who's on what side at one time or another, but I'll tell you, a lot of times when you see these pictures of concentration camps with kids peering from behind the barbed wire, and there's a sign next to it, looks like German, look closely, because it's not German, it's Finnish. Okay? Now, maybe the Germans print German on the top and Finnish on the bottom. I don't know what's up with that, but hey. So a lot of Soviets spent time in these camps, and who knows who else? Who knows who else, right? We're only going by what we told. But I'll tell you, over in that part of the world, that area that changed hands between Poland and Finland and the Soviets, parts of Latvia, Estonia, etc., all these areas that are now different countries, they're still digging up bodies from that period of time. They're still digging them up, and they're still identifying those people, cataloging what killed them. This is an ongoing thing. What's the point of this? Who's the bad guy here? Again, it's the same damn people. And when I say people, I'm not talking about people from a certain country. No, I'm talking about elements of those people that seem to be indigenous to those parts of the world that are responsible for all this stuff. Elements like Rothschild types. Anyway, so what happened? You think, wow, why would Finland do this? What made them so strong? And yet at the same time, again, here we are after the war and all that. We don't talk about these things. It's okay. We'll talk about the atrocities committed by the Nazis, but we won't talk about the atrocities committed by our ally, the Finns. That's a whole other thing. And again, I'm not trying to demonize the Finns, because I'm not trying to demonize the Poles. I'm not trying to demonize the Nazis. I'm not trying to demonize the Soviets. Could demonize all of them. UK, USA, whatever. Take your pick. Anyway, the point is that what you think you know isn't always the way it is. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of other stuff I wanted to tell you, but we're running out of time. So I'm not really going to go any further. I'm going to kind of leave it at that. But the point is that it's always been the same people. And this wealth that these guys are using, it's created out of nothing. Now, I was a jeweler, and I know how that works, but seriously, people, we're all responsible. This has been going on for 211 years. And today, they're acting like, oh, you should have seen it coming. I warned you. You should have listened to me. As if what? As if all he had to do was take away the gripes of this one deranged man, Mr. Bellingham? I don't know. But anyway, Perceval, you may not have liked Catholics, and you may have been kind of a dick when it comes to your elitist upbringing, but overall, you're a decent guy. You weren't a drunk. You didn't go carousing. You took care of your children. It's just very unfortunate that they didn't survive you. I don't know what the hell, man. I don't know. That's just not right. But otherwise, he was also a lord over England, or not England, but what was it? Ireland. And I suspect that means that he was one of those guys that told the Irish what to do. And I don't know if that's such a good thing, but to me, that makes him kind of Irish. Either way, Perceval, I know you didn't drink a lot, but we're gonna have a toast tonight. If I can get the whole place to give you a toast, I will. But the world should have seen this coming. The same guys that killed this guy killed all these presidents. They killed 2 senators, Bobby. Now we got Bobby's son running for president. Personally, I hope he wins. And I'll tell you something. If I had the opportunity to offer, I'll stand in front of that guy. You know what I mean? I'll give him some Jedi protection. I want him in my circle so I know he's protected. If you guys can set that up, do it for me. Again, I want to remind you guys to help me out economically. I know it's really a strain right now, and I wish more people would help out because so I hear there's a lot of people out listening that I can't see. But if you are out there and you can do something, if you've never done it before, please consider doing it for my birthday. But again, PayPal, what can I say? What else? All right, that's not what I'm here for, but help me out. Next week, hopefully I'm going to get a lot of work done after the show, and we're going to upgrade a lot of our electronics and things around here, so hopefully our delivery will be a little bit better. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the show tonight. And once again, what's the title of tonight's show? I don't even know if we had a title. Wait, it's Spencer Perceval. That's it, Spencer Perceval. All right. Okay, you guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Beyond all my rambling and all that stuff, I hope you could figure out what the bottom line of this. But you know who the enemy is, okay? 211 years. We haven't figured out who the enemy is. The same guys that are telling you what to think, the same guys that control this Wikipedia and everything else, the same guys that have shut us down to where we only can talk to you from the smallest of platforms, and Telegram is one of them, right out of Russia, okay? Oh, by the way, Bakhmut, no, it did not fall. It's down to the last few hundred square feet. Come on. It's in the hands of Russia. Nothing happened. That's all false news, okay? I'll talk to you guys more about this stuff soon, okay? Yeah, 6:57. Okay, once again, it's still May 11th, 2023, the 211th anniversary of the assassination of Spencer Perceval. It's now 6:57 here in sunny La Puente, California. And again, my name is Steven D Kelley. Hopefully I'll get my Twitter back very soon. I'm working on it, but I got Google fighting with me. Anyway, this is Truthcat Radio, www.truthcatradio.com, and this is the Steven D Kelley Show. And God willing, I will see you guys next week, okay, if you show up. And thank you for being here if you did show up. And please work harder, okay? Enjoy my group on Telegram, Occupy/Steven D Kelley. Please help us out. All right, with that, I'll see you, okay? Good night. God bless. Adios. And Goodbye.